guys, so in this lesson I want to talk about chord substitution. Now, chord substitution is used in jazz to, as the name suggests, substitute one chord for another to make a chord progression more interesting, more complex, and less cliche. Like, for example, instead of playing a 2-5-1 in the key of C major in this case, so D minor, G7, C. Instead of playing that, you can substitute the C major, for example, for an A minor. Right, and that sounds sort of a bit different, a bit less cliche. So in this lesson, I'm going to take you through the 5 most common chord substitutions that you can use in whatever chord progression you like. So let's begin. The first chord substitution I'm going to show you is called the median note substitution, which essentially means the middle note. So if you have a C major, the middle note is E. So instead of C major, you play E minor. Now notice, if I play a C major 7, these 3 notes are in E minor, and then there's a C at the bottom. And that's why the chord substitution works. Effectively, E minor is just the top part of C major 7. And if I play E minor 7, which you can do as a chord substitution, then that's effectively the top part of C major 9. Now you can do the other way as well. Another median note chord substitution for C major is A minor. So it's a third down instead of a third up. And the median note there is actually the C. So instead of playing C major, you can play A minor 7. So that's the C major triad with an A at the bottom. And you'll notice that's effectively a C6. Just with the A down the bottom, the 6 down the bottom. So again, that's the reason why that chord substitution works. And it works in minor chords as well. So for A minor, the 2 median note substitute chords are C major and F major. So it's a third up and a third down. The next type of chord substitution I'm going to show you is substituting a 2-5-1 in place of a 5-1. So if you have a chord progression that sits on G7 and then resolves to the C, so a 5 to the 1, you can play a 2-5-1 in place, a D minor 7, G7 to the C7. So the reason that works is because it runs down the circle of fifths. D to G to C is going down the circle of fifths. Now if you don't know what that means, check out my other lesson or any other lesson on the circle of fifths, because it's really important and really useful and really helpful when thinking about chord progressions or keys or music in general. And you can extend that further. If you have a long period of time where you sit on the G7, so in a chord progression, you can substitute that for a 3-6-2-5-1 in place of just the 5-1. You obviously need a bit more time on the 5 in order to substitute all of those chords in, but so it'll sound something like this. Which sounds a bit more interesting than just... Right, so that's just substituting a 2-5 in place of a 5. The third way I'm going to show you is effectively the same thing. You substitute a 2-5, but instead of playing the minor, you play the dominant. So instead of playing D minor 7 to G7 to C, you play D7 to G7 to C. And that can work again going all the way up from E to A to D to G, all 7s to the C. So still going through the cycle of fifths, but playing the dominant version of each chord. The next one I'm going to show you is the diminished substitution. Now this is in place of a dominant chord. So if you have a G7, you can substitute that for a G sharp diminished. So again, if you see that the only note that's different is the G. Instead of playing G, B, D, F, you play G sharp, B, D, F. So that's a great little substitute you can use in place of a dominant chord to make it a bit more interesting and jazzy. And the last chord substitution I'm going to show you is the famous tritone substitution. Now this applies to dominant chords as well. So if you're playing a G7, you can substitute that by a D flat 7. Now that might seem a bit confusing, but bear with me. So the reason it's called a tritone substitution is because there are 3 tones between the notes. So between G and D flat. So that's 1, 2, 3 tones. Thus tritone substitution. If you watched my video on chord extensions, you'll know that the 3rd and the 7th are the most important notes in a chord. And that's because the 3rd indicates whether it's a minor or a major chord, and the 7th indicates whether it's a major 7 or a dominant chord. Now, if you notice, the 3rd and the 7th of G7 are B and F. D flat 7, the 3rd is F and the 7th is B. So they're the same notes, just the 3rd becomes the 7th and the 7th becomes the 3rd of the tritone substitution. And that's why it works. The key notes are still, the important notes of the chord are still there. So using those 5 chord substitutions, you can do quite a lot and make a simple chord progression sound a lot more interesting. Like, for example, let's take a standard 5-1. So, right, we're just playing 1 bar of G, and then 1 bar of C. Now we can substitute that for a 2-5-1, as I said. So it's become a half bar of D minor 7, a half bar of G7, and then a bar of C. Now we can change that, the D minor 7 to a D7, so it becomes, so that's D7, G7, C. Then you can substitute the D7 with a tritone substitution, which would be the A flat, 1, 2, 3. So you could play right, so that already sounds more interesting. So instead of just the 5 to the 1, we've changed it to the A flat 7 to the G7 to the C. Those are the type of things you can do to make a chord progression more interesting, more jazzy, especially if you have a chord progression where you play one chord for a long period of time, and you really want to jazz that up and make it sound a bit more interesting and make it sound like there's a bit more going on, instead of just sitting on the... You do something like... If you want to see how chord substitutions are used in practice, then check out my video on the jazzed up version of the 12-bar blues, where I, instead of just using the standard 1-4-5-1 type 12-bar blues progression, I do a whole bunch of chord substitutions, all of which I've covered here. So things like using the F sharp half diminished instead of the F7, and then using a cycle of fifths run back to the C rather than just playing the G. So have a look at that, links just here, and that'll give you sort of an idea of how you can actually use chord substitutions and put it into your own songs or into existing songs to make it a bit more interesting and jazzy. Anyway, thanks guys, see ya.